And in fact, what was one of the words that Mark uses more than any other gospel writer? Immediately, right? And then immediately this happened, and immediately that happened. And so he's been going really, really fast. And now we've slowed things down. And now this is what some commentators, some people looking at the Gospel of Mark, they look at Mark as in 3 different acts. Act 1 is Mark 1 through chapter 7. Act 2 is Mark 8, 9, and 10. And then Act 3 is when we start to get to the cross. And that is the 3rd and final act, if you will, of Mark's Gospel. Okay, so in the context of all of these things, we have just seen that Jesus is starting to tell his disciples what important truth about his life? That he's what? He's going to die. And that makes no sense to a first century Jewish audience who thinks that he may be the Messiah. In fact, that is the confession that Peter makes there in Mark and in chapter 8, because the Messiah is not supposed to die, because dying would mean losing. And losing would mean you're not the Messiah. And you're supposed to win, okay? And by winning, you're supposed to be victorious, kind of like King David was as far as that Messiah individual. So now Jesus has gone up on the mountain. He's been transfigured. The people have been able to see his glory as far as Peter, James, and John. Who were the other 2 guys that were up there too? Moses and Elijah. Right? And we talked about how that they also had mountaintop experiences. They also had Mount Sinai experiences and seeing the glory of God. And then now these disciples can see the glory of God being Jesus Christ also. All right, so Jesus is coming down the mountain. Okay, so we are continuing the story. And if you're watching this as a movie, it might say, meanwhile, back at the ranch. Right? So now we're getting the meanwhile, what's happening back at the ranch. And Jesus is walking down the mountain. So we'll pick up in verse 14. Now I want you to be paying attention to what is said here. We're going to read this as a lengthy reading, but I want you to try to also be able to pick out some interesting points of things that are going on here. Verse 14. This is the New King James Version. And when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and scribes disputing with them. Immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted him. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" or disputing with them? Then one of the crowd answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit. And wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." He answered and said, this is Jesus speaking, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." Then they brought him to him, and when he had saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell down on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. He asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that the people came together, running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more." Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. And he became as one dead, so that many said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." Ooh, I got Mike suddenly. All right, so let's think about this passage. All right, and how I want us to help frame our mind with this passage is make sure that we are picking up in the context of Mark's story and in the context of what Mark is trying to teach us in this moment. And one of the reasons why I want us to do that is because I think so many times, and it's not necessarily bad, but so many times we look at different stories of Jesus and we just look at them as their own unit, not realizing that there is a greater plan that is going on. There is a greater thing that is trying to be described there also. So when we think about this passage, okay, when we think about Mark and in chapter 9, what are some things that jump out at you that you find interesting, that you have a question about, or that you find devotionally helpful for you as you look at this passage? Yes, sir. All right, that this demon, either this kind of demon or this thing right here can only be cast out by prayer. All right, which raises a couple questions to me. Now, first of all, in some translations, like the King James, New King James, says prayer and fasting. There are other manuscripts, so this is a manuscript type criticism. Most of our best manuscripts don't have the word and fasting, they just have the word prayer. So either way you look at it, this raises a couple questions. Why then couldn't the disciples cast out this demon? Because it says, because this is going to be cast out by prayer, what are some assumptions that perhaps you can make about the disciples? That they weren't praying about this. Which brings up another question in my mind. Well, how in the world then did they try to get this demon out of this young man? Right. So it seems to be, now this is just me reading in between the lines, now that these disciples, did they have the ability to cast out demons? Yes, they did. Okay. In fact, earlier in Mark chapter 6, they do just that. Okay. But for whatever reason, at this time, they were not able to cast out demons. And so, and what Jesus says, because this only comes out with prayer, which brings to mind to me that perhaps they did not pray about this, that they thought that they could cast out the demon by their own power, which makes this entire section about the struggle between belief and unbelief. And what does Jesus call the audience there? What does he say to them earlier on in this section? A faithless generation. Now, when he says faithless generation, who do you think he's talking to? That's what I heard. Who's he talking to? He's talking to his disciples. Who else? He's talking to the scribes. He's talking to the general crowd and audience. Who's the other main character in this story? The boy's father. And me and you. We too are a faithless generation, okay? The entire struggle that we are seeing in this entire text here is a struggle that I believe that each and every one of you have experienced, because I have experienced. It's the struggle that says, I believe, but help me with my unbelief. And one of the reasons why I love this passage is for that prayer that this man has, right? And if you have never been there before, then you just haven't lived long enough yet. But there will come a time, and perhaps you have experienced this, and maybe you experienced it over and over and over again, that there is this tension. Yes, I believe, but I also struggle with unbelief. Now think about this too. 1 second, I'll get to you. Think about this. Jesus says only this can come out by prayer. But then what does Jesus not do in the story? He never prays. So how can Jesus say, this type of demon only comes out by prayer, but I'm not going to pray? How does that work? He is God, okay? See, the disciples, they needed God. They needed faith in God. They needed to believe in God. They needed to do things God's way. They needed to pray to Him and not depend upon themselves. Jesus needed to depend upon Himself because He is God, okay? Now, yes, Tamara. Right. Definitely so. I think about the story in the book of Acts. Remember the prayer meeting in Acts? That there was Peter. Where was Peter at the time? He was in jail. And what were the people doing at John Mark's house? They were all praying that he would what? He would be released from jail. And then while they're in there praying, there's a knock at the door. Little servant girl Rhoda comes up to the door and is like, "Oh, it's Peter." And then shuts the door and then goes back to everybody that's been praying and says, "Hey, Peter's at the door." And they're like, "No, honey, he's in jail." "But what have you been praying for, church?" "That he be released." And then she says, No, seriously, he's at the that must be his angel. That must be his messenger. That's not actually him. But eventually they're like, "Oh, it is him," right? And so the early church struggled with that. The disciples struggled with that. This man with this child struggles with that. You and I struggle with that. And the only way to help our struggle is to show our dependence upon God. So there's another thing that I could think about. The other reason why the disciples could not cast out this demon is not only because they had a lack of prayer, but I can also imagine they had a lack of humility. Because if they were humble enough to realize that they needed God's help and they could not do it on their own, then perhaps they would have depended upon God. Remember, what's the thing that we see throughout chapter 8, 9, and 10? What is the thing that we see the disciples fighting about the most? Who's the best? Who's the greatest? Who's the most wonderful in the kingdom? Who's going to have the most power? And I can imagine, this is me imagining, okay? I'm trying to picture this scene. So Jesus has been up on the mountain and he's walking back down. He looks, as he's coming down, he sees this crowd of people. He can differentiate the scribes from his own disciples because more than likely the scribes perhaps dressed a little bit differently than his disciples did perhaps. And they're having this dispute. And I can imagine what happened is that this man who has this child, who has this demon, has come up. He has asked for their help. The disciples, perhaps, Peter, James, and John are gone. I don't know who it was, but somebody else has tried to step up to the plate. And like, I can take care of this one. Demon, come out. I don't know what happened, but it didn't happen. And so now what do the scribes do? Gloat? Maybe? I mean, these are the same scribes that earlier tried to attribute the power of Jesus casting out demons to Beelzebub himself. And so I can just imagine the scribes going, "Oh, well, y'all thought y'all were so big and powerful. Obviously, this entire movement of Jesus is a farce." And he's talking to the crowd about these things. And I think what's interesting is that Jesus asks what is going on, right? So look in there in verse 16. And he asks the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" We never get the answer to that question. But look what happens in verse 17. Then one of the crowd answered and said, who's the one of the crowd? That's the father. That's the dad. Can you imagine the dad for a moment? He hears them fussing and fighting about why they couldn't cast out the demon. And in the meantime, the dad's like, "By the way, I came here because of my son. And I'm tired of you all fighting about these things. Here's what needs to take place." Now, who did the father, his own words now, who did he say that he brought his son to? I brought him to you, referring to Jesus. But when he got there, where was Jesus? Not there, right? And so what should be the next best thing if not Jesus? His disciples. But in the process, his disciples mess things up. Now here's something that I glean from this. People in the world should be trying to find Jesus. The next best thing should be me living as Jesus would have me to live. But sometimes, when people try to view Jesus through his disciples, it messes things up. And this man has a whole different view of what's going to happen for his son. And why do we know he has a different view? Where do you see his struggle? What does he say? He's crying, and anytime we start talking about kids and seeing a kid that's struggling, and all of us as parents, at least us as parents that like our children, right? We also struggle and seeing the pain, perhaps, that this man is going through. But what does he... Okay, he says, help my unbelief, but look what he says there in... All right, verse 22. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. So this is a horrible situation. Not only is he being tormented, and this tormenting has happened since childhood. I don't know how old the son is now, but it seems like at some period of time has been taking place that he's being tormented to the point that it's almost killing him. Okay, so it attacks him, if you will, when he's close to a fire. He's close to a body of water so that he might die. And then he asks the question, but if you can do anything. Now, why in the world would he have such a great amount of doubt in Jesus? He brought Jesus, and he brought his son to Jesus in the first place. Why does he say, but if you can? The disciples couldn't do it. And if his disciples couldn't do it, then maybe Jesus can't do it either. So we see that struggle there. He is asking basically, not that this similar earlier there about the leper is if you're willing to save me, but now it's not about willingness, it's about ability. Does Jesus have the ability to help this man or not? Does Jesus have the ability to save this young one's life or not? And obviously, we know that he does, but this man is doubting. Okay, and what I see screaming at me in all of this is our own discipleship and our own reflection of Jesus, that perhaps sometimes we are telling the world that Jesus isn't as great as he actually is. Because people bring themselves to the Lord, but they see us instead, and then they leave thinking, is he able to? Is the Lord able to do this or not? Okay, I've been all over the place. Questions or comments about any of that? Yes, ma'am. Perhaps, so the comment is that you don't know what you don't know sometimes, and perhaps they have never met this type of demon before, and that this certain kind, having that word kind, makes us think that perhaps there are different classifications thereof of demons. I'm not exactly how sure about all of that, but that they need to pray with this type, and maybe with other types they could simply command, and thankfully they were humble enough to ask. And I do think that I'm thankful that they were humble enough to ask, but I think they get to that point after they are humiliated, right? And that brings us to humble sometimes, being humiliated, but I think that's what has taken place here. They are humiliated, and they don't want to be humiliated again, and so they ask Jesus, how did this take place? Any other questions or comments? Yes, Terry. Well, you remember there was the conversation, I don't remember exactly where it is now, about another demon, about how that they had swept it clean and then 7 more came in, and I think maybe even the term of 7 there might be that it's even worse, like a more complete number has come in. You've had other times where Jesus is telling the individual that go and sin no more, and so maybe not allowing this to happen again if there is any type of allowing on their part. But what Jesus is showing here, what I think by the verbiage, is that this is a finality as far as this. This boy will never have to deal with this ever again after this moment. At least that's what I'm understanding from that. Who's got a different translation that can read verse 23? So, verse 22, but if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Somebody have ESV or NIV? What do you have?
23?
Yes.
And this struck me. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for him who believes.
Okay, how is it punctuated in yours?
It's in quotes with a question mark.
Okay, in quotes with a question mark. So that is, if you can, and I would imagine that if we were writing it today, we would have a question mark followed by a exclamation point, right? So it's not just if you can, it's if you can. How do you think Jesus said this? Because I don't know, I wasn't there, and you weren't there, but how do you imagine him saying, if you can? And how can we take it in multiple different ways? Okay.
If he says, if you can, it's like no doubt.
Okay, don't doubt me, have faith. So he's almost that he is repeating the words of the man like in astonishment, if you can, like I'm not able to. So maybe it's if you can. All right, how else can we understand if you can? Yes. Right. So there's another way to look at it. So now Jesus is not saying, if you can, like me, like if I can, but he's turning it back on him and saying, well, you asked me if I can do anything. I'm now asking you, can you believe? If you can. So there the emphasis is on the you instead of the can, perhaps. If you can, all things are possible for those who believe. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yep. Can you now have the proper belief? And we're not told the rest of the story, but I want you to put yourself in the place of the father, and your father, you as, not the father as in God the Father, but as the dad in the story, right? Put yourself in the place of the dad in the story. If your son has had this ailment, this demon since childhood that is sometimes can kill him or about to kill him, do you think this is the first time you've ever done anything about it? I'm sure they've gone to, and you can read, by the way, of Jewish exorcists of that time and the different things that they would try to do in getting out evil spirits and stuff. And so perhaps he also is lacking faith because he just has a lack of faith in people in general. He's tried this, he's tried that. Now he has come to the disciples and they have failed. Will Jesus fail also? Yes, ma'am. Sure.
And Jesus said, and have this in quotation marks, you say to me, if you can do anything, and then in quotation why, all things can be and come in,
Thank you.
are possible to him who believes. So he really did, well, it looks like he is putting it back on him, as if to say, you're questioning me as to whether or not I can do it.
And now,
And if you can believe.
right, I am waiting on your belief. And that may be the case. And this just shows us one of the things about Scripture, okay? So remember, when Mark originally wrote the Scripture, it was all capital letters with no spaces and no punctuation, okay? So please never make an argument just by punctuation, right? Don't go into the text and say, well, see, there's a comma there, and we know what a comma means. There's no commas there, okay? And same thing, don't do anything with the capitalization, because sometimes we read our New Testament and we'll see like a small s spirit, or we'll see a big S spirit, and we'll go, well, obviously this is talking about the Holy Spirit because it has a capital S right here. Well, obviously, right? That's what some translator has obviously decided for you, to put a big S there. Okay, there's no capitalization in the original Greek. But I just want to show you how that when we start reading this and reading it different ways, how it is saying the same thing, but different things are popping out at us about it. Okay, yes, Josh.
I also like how this story has the evidence right in the middle of it. It's not just this man claiming that his son has a demon, but in verse 20, he actually seizes him.
Yep.
So then you see with the eyewitness accounts of all of this, it inspires belief combined with the evidence that we need to understand.
Definitely so. And from an apologetic standpoint, it is interesting the great details that Mark brings up. It's as if that there was somebody there that actually saw all this happen and reported it to Mark. And Mark, through the Holy Spirit, recorded it for us. What we understand is that Peter was the one that is telling Mark most of the story, if you will. And then by inspiration, he is writing these things down. And this is very unlike Mark. In fact, if you were to look at the other two accounts, which is Matthew 17 and Luke 9, perhaps, if you look at the other two accounts, those accounts are shorter compared to Mark's, which is longer, which is unusual for Mark. But Mark may be trying to do something extra special for us here. Yes, Angel. Yeah. I have no doubt that the dad in the story had heard about Jesus and had heard about what he was able to do. Whether that is because of the man in Mark chapter 5, or because that he'd been casting out demons all over the place in different areas, I don't know. What's interesting is that this is this is one of 3 miracle stories in this entire section, okay? So we have the miracle story of the blind man at the beginning of this section. We have this miracle story in the middle. And then at the end of this section, we have the miracle story of the other blind man. Okay, remember the first blind man had to be healed twice, if you will. We have the last blind man that is able to see everything clearly. And in the middle, we have this story too. But it seems to be that evidence, as Josh was pointing out, shows us exactly what is taking place here, and he really wants us to focus in on those things. And why does Mark decide to put this story here at this time. Now, I am of the opinion that the gospel writers do not have to write in chronological order if they do not want to. Okay? I think the Gospel of John is very evident in not writing in chronological order all the time. But I think they are putting together a gospel, a good news, to tell you something about Jesus. Why place this story, just like they place the story of the blind man at the beginning of this and the blind man at the end of this, why place this story here? What is the overall thing that you're supposed to get from it, or whether the disciples are supposed to get from it, and what are you as disciples supposed to get from it? All right, definitely staying faithful. Yes, sir. Definitely so. Definitely you have the request of the Father, and just playing off of that, if you were just, and this is one of those, so this is just a sermonizing type thing, a preacher thing, where you look in verse 19, O faithless generation, how long shall it be with me? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. And the preacher point you make, parents, bring your children to the Lord. There it is, right there. Bring him to me. You could spend all right, thank you, good night, right? So we could really spend the rest of it just thinking about that. But definitely we have a man talking and on petition of his son to have this salvation. Tracy, what did you say again? That
Being faithful, staying strong.
all right, being faithful, staying strong. Why do the disciples need to hear this, and why do they need to hear it right now? All right, he's getting ready to leave. In fact, we know he's getting ready to leave because what does he say? What does Jesus, oh faithless generation, how long? Now, sometimes you can look at that and it's like, you can take it as exasperated Jesus, right? Like parent Jesus after you've told your kids 8,000 times the same thing, they still don't do it. And you're like, how long, how many times do I have to? And maybe that's the type of Jesus that we're looking at. Or perhaps he is thinking, how much longer do I actually have with you? I don't have that much longer of time. And guess what? You still don't get it. He had earlier had asked them, said, how many baskets were there when I fed the 5,000? And they were like, 12. And then he says, and how many baskets were there when I fed the 4,000? That's not a story we got to in our sermons, I'm sorry. But there were 7. And he's like, and you still don't believe? And here they're still not believing. So I think part of the reason for this story here is because his disciples are struggling with faith in who Jesus actually is and what that actually means. And now he's giving another illustration about how to have that faith. Yes, Rob.
Jesus could have easily made 12 little Jesuses
Definitely.
carry out and begin a ministry, but all these miracles that he's done, and he says in other words, all these, he did a lot more that were written so that we would believe.
Right.
The apostles still had to believe as well. And so he is teaching them, and this is a point where they couldn't cast out the demon because they got maybe a little cocky. Things were going good. Hey, we're doing this, we're doing that. And it's time for now an awakening of continue your schooling with your faith as well as the faith of this man whose son brought to him. So all of this is a faith-based.
Definitely.
It's a believing attitude. I want you to believe in me, believe in me, believe in me. Not just be me because
Right.
I'm good and you believe me. And so they're learning to, the disciples had to come to Christ just like everybody else.
Definitely so.
Or it would not, none of us would have the ability to choose our own outcome with this. So he's convincing with miracles as well. He's given proof to everybody who he says he is, but he's given us and the apostles as well the option, which one of them did not adhere to believe on them on their own and come to that same understanding
Definitely so. And I am so thankful that Jesus didn't make 12 little Jesuses, because I am thankful that these are disciples, and these are disciples that struggle. And that means that if I'm going to be a disciple, it's okay if I struggle also. And I think something else is never let us be so arrogant to the point that we don't keep praying, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. I think this is something that we can continually, whether you are a brand new Christian or you've been a Christian for years and years, Lord, help my unbelief. I'm glad you have more comments. We're going to close with this, okay? And then we'll look at one more thing in a minute. I want you to go, I'm just going to read again for us, and then we'll go into our time of worship. Look at verse 26, okay? Then the Spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. And he became as one dead, so that many said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. We're going to use that as an opportunity for an invitation in a moment. So hold your spot there, and we'll get back there in just a moment, okay? We're going to enter into a time of worship. I think we have some songs and such. And so I encourage you to sing out. Who is leading singing? Jonathan, you are? All right, what's our first song?
Number 570.
Number 570. Let's all stand together as Jonathan leads us.